You're listening to Online Pet Health Podcasts with Dr. Megan Kelly. Continuing education for veterinarian rehabilitation therapists. Learn more at onlinepethealth.com.
Hey Vet Rehabbers, so today I'm going to share with you the story actually about how Online Pet Health started. So it actually started out of a personal need for myself. So I was feeling really stagnant in my learning about veterinary rehabilitation. I qualified in 2001 as a vet, and then in 2005 I did my CCRP. And from 2005 to 2015, I really was struggling to find more ways in which I could learn and gain more experience. And being the only vet rehabber in my practice, I wasn't able to learn from anybody else. Those of you that have one-man practices will know about this. It's really lonely sometimes. And I was reading all the research articles. I had all the textbooks by that time that was out there. And I just really was feeling so stagnant, and I just felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. I was attending conferences. So every 2 years, the IAVRPT have a conference, and I was attending that one. But to be honest, it was quite a stretch because I usually had to travel overseas. So it's either in America or in Europe somewhere, and really expensive. And then also I had to find somebody to cover my patients while I was gone. And that was really difficult at that time because there weren't many vet rehabbers in South Africa, although it's really grown over the last few years. But every 2 years just wasn't enough for me. So at one of these IAVRPT conferences, I met Matt Brunke, and Matt was doing a workshop on kinesiotaping. And I remember at the time I was interested in it, but I couldn't afford it. So I didn't do it, but afterwards I spoke to him and I said, I'd really love to get you to South Africa to come and teach kinesiotaping. And so what I did was I created this WhatsApp group for all the vet rehabbers in South Africa, and I said to Matt, are you able to come out? And when we looked at the pricing, it was just way too expensive. It was going to be too costly for us. And then Matt made a suggestion. He said, I've done a webinar or two for other companies. Maybe I could teach it online. And I had no clue how to do anything about webinars or host webinars. But I did have some experience with websites because in 2015, I had launched an online course for pet owners. So I did know how to sort of do some online stuff. So I thought, I'm just going to give it a go. And so I Googled webinar platforms and I found Webinar Ninja. I don't even know if they're still around, Webinar Ninja. And we hosted this webinar. We did 2 webinars, 1 week apart, 2 hours on kinesiotaping. And what I did was I contacted all the vet rehabbers that I know. And I said to them, if you're interested, you can sign up. And then we just took the cost and divided it amongst us. And I think there were 16 of us in total for that very first webinar. After that webinar, what happened was everyone was just saying, that was amazing. Please, can you organize another one? And then after I had organized the second one, they were like, let's do this every single month. And so I thought, okay. And initially, I really had just sort of thought about having this platform and this learning opportunity for the South Africans. And so we had organized once a month, and people had said, can you divide the cost? And so I worked out what it would be, and we paid, sort of people were paying on a monthly basis. And as the year went by, more and more vet rehabbers were saying, my friend who lives in Australia would love to join. Can they also sign up? And I said, yeah, sure. And before I knew it, there were people from all over the world that were attending this webinars. And Online Pet Health had pivoted from online courses for pet owners to an online education platform for vet rehabbers. And here we are now today, 5 years down the line. So I'm absolutely amazed that it's 5 years, and I can't believe where myself and my team have taken Online Pet Health. So I just want to say a big thank you to my team, and the team has grown throughout the years. And as it's our birthday month, together with Pulse Vet, so a big shout out to Pulse Vet. Thank you so much for sponsoring this webinar. We are gifting you, the vet rehabber, a free live webinar. It's called The Pressure to Perform, Choosing Extracorporeal Shockwave Therapy Devices, and it's with Melissa King. So if you want to sign up to this, you can go to www.onlinepethealth.com/birthday. I repeat that, www.onlinepethealth.com/birthday. So today's podcast is a snippet from our Vet Rehab Summit. So every year in November, we organize an online conference for our Online Pet Health members. If you want to find more about the membership, you can go to onlinepethealth.com. Our members get free VIP access to the summit. So today, the snippet that we're sharing is with lecturers Lowri, Davies and Sheila Schils, and they share the mechanical aspects of rehabilitation as they relate to the equine and the canine that are recovering from injury. One of the snippets that I loved that they shared was, when you heal in a static environment, you create static healing. When you heal in a dynamic environment, you create dynamic healing. So over to Lowri and Sheila. You guys are really going to enjoy this one.
I do have a question on that, because I think that you're very right in that we are often too cautious and too slow. But if we consider the healing timelines of certain tissues like tendons and ligaments that can take 12 months to reach maybe 80 to 90% of their original tensile strength, how do we progress without overload in that time? Are we being too slow if we're looking at a 3 to 6 month rehabilitation plan for a ligament or a tendon, or is that okay? Should we be more aggressive? I'm not sure.
Right. And I think you've hit an excellent point, Anne, is that we are really redoing those healing protocols. Healing is happening so much faster than we ever thought. Remember when I started this process, it was in the 90s. And today we are looking at healing happening at almost 50% faster than we thought it would. And one of the reasons that we're looking at that is because we're adding dynamic movement patterns very, very early on in the healing process. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, we were still after surgery saying, oh, you got to rest for 4 to 6 weeks, and then you can start to exercise the tissue. We know now, if you know anyone who's had knee surgery, that evening they're putting them in a constant passive motion device. So they are moving that tissue immediately after surgery. So we are cutting down those protocols. So I would challenge people to really look at some of these older healing patterns and try to integrate some of the new information that we have on healing. I do say that by the time you are going to reach pre-injury status, or as close to pre-injury status as you can, it's going to be a year. But that doesn't mean that that's a year without competition. That means that that's a year that you're going to change the tissue so that when the horse walks out of the stall, they look different. But that doesn't mean that you can't still bring these horses back into competition. It's just that you have to be very, very aware of their biomechanics and ride them in certain ways so that they don't re-injure. But that would be a whole nother 2-hour presentation. But yes, we really are shortening those healing times so easily by 50% from what we were doing back in the 90s.
If you don't mind me just jumping in quite quickly, there are some studies, particularly there's a lot of work in the tendon labs at UC Davies that have shown, working with human athletes, particularly in terms of ligament and tendon healing, that a 3-day protocol works really well, so that you overload and you cause damage. So you're trying to get adaptive remodeling. So you are in a negative balance. So you're breaking down collagen in the first 24 hours. In the second 24 hours, you reach a neutral point. And then in the third 24 hours, you're actually then adaptively laying down more collagen. So we think we can use, and certainly I do it in the clinic, that I have for my plyometrics exercises where I'm, sort of statically overloading tendons and ligaments. I do it every 3 days to try to follow that protocol. So you minimize your inflammatory response. You do get maximizing of your remodeling, and it allows for repair. So it's a constant. I think it's important to get away from the inflammatory, reparative and remodeling as being a static thing that happens at 4 days, sort of 2 weeks, 6 weeks. It's something that is continuously happening in response to overload. But what rehab does is that it fine tunes that so that you can sort of get much, much earlier healing times.
And then Sarah McKeegan asks, she's curious about exercise progression in dogs or horses with more chronic pain that are stuck in wind up. Is your approach different?
Yeah, very good question. Because again, and it kind of relates again to this next slide, is that when you see a lameness, you think that the animal is in pain. So, with animals, it's very, very difficult, really, as it is in humans, to figure out why they are in pain, because just due to an asymmetrical movement pattern doesn't mean that that animal is in pain. I have a 92-year-old father who walks around with a slight limp, and I'm like, "Are you in pain?" And he's like, "No, not at all." So you have to be really careful about, this evaluation of what is painful and what is not, just because it's asymmetrical. So as Lowri just said, when we're looking at a rehab protocol, you cannot be afraid of pain, because if the animals are not in a little bit of discomfort, they're not going to progress to obtain that pre-injury status, because you have to tear down materials that are in there, which are a repository of the inflammatory process, or break them up or move them out of there to be able to heal properly. So when you have an inflammatory response, we go into the back room and we go, "Yay, we're finally getting some changes." You have to, again, be careful with that, because people see inflammation and all of a sudden they want to take it down, which is good because you don't want to keep that inflammatory response. But phagocytosis, that is absolutely necessary before you can get healing. So when you're in a rehab protocol and you have pain or you have inflammation, that's just saying that you are moving along to change that tissue. Now, are you moving along to change the tissue for better or for worse? That's the $1 million question. And that's when you have to be knowledgeable. You have to look at other aspects of the healing process. And that's when it becomes an art form rather than a science. And that's when we go back to our 3-day protocol. If the inflammation process continues to increase, then we know, okay, we've probably gone too far. If the inflammation process occurs and then we can take it right back down, then we're going, okay, we're probably fine with this. It's just part of the natural healing process.
And I also think it's important to make the distinction between acute and chronic pain, whereby acute pain is likely to mirror tissue damage, but in chronic pain, the two are very divorced. And we can have a considerable amount of chronic pain where there actually is very little tissue damage. So I think that, again, makes managing the chronic pain case very different to the acute stage.
So this goes back again to the conversation about, do you exercise the horse or do you rest the horse? And what we're finding is that rest is not the first choice. Rest is the last choice. And that's when all of us in rehab are put into a quandary, because it's very easy to blame the rehab specialist when they give you a protocol that includes a lot of exercise if the horse re-injures. But in our mind, because we think that we're over exercising the animals, that rest is a much safer protocol. But we're learning that rest is probably the most unsafe protocol. And something that I say to my rehab clients is, I say, if the horse is so fragile that they have to stand in their stalls for 6 months, then maybe they're just too fragile to rehab, and that you need to think about that, they're done with their career. We have to realize that when we treat this tissue as if it's so fragile that it's going to heal as we treat it. If we treat this tissue such as that it's dynamic and strong, and we expect it to be dynamic and strong, it will heal that way, is the thought process. When you heal in a static environment, you create static healing. When you heal in a dynamic environment, you create dynamic healing. And the hard thing is for all of us is what is too little and what is too much. But typically, if you're kind of a little bit more old school, you have to be pushed a little bit. to stay up with the current understanding of healing, is that you'll probably tend to be a little bit more stand back, a little bit more rested. If you're more updated with your education, you'll probably move it a little bit more forward. So when I see human rehab specialists, that's kind of what I see, is that you have to really sometimes let go of some of these old thoughts that you had about rehabilitation and stay current with some of the new research that we're using.
Okay, I have a few questions before we move on. So first, a comment from Michelle. She says, I love this discussion. Again, the importance of treating the whole animal becomes clear. We cannot delineate structural and functional dysfunction. It needs to be addressed concurrently. And then Donna asks, can we have some examples of the papers that suggest this? It's a big thing to explain to our vets if they have not seen this or if they're focused on rest. So I think some citations would be really helpful. Do you have
Yes. Yes, and actually probably the easiest way is there's some of our published papers out there on rehabilitation. It's all equine based. You can find them on ResearchGate under my name, Sheila Schils. And the papers are also on our website, which is equinu.com, equine.com. Just look under publications and you'll see lots and lots of publications there on healing times, rate of recovery, on specific exercises to do for specific rehab protocols. So that's probably the easiest way. And they're all documented. Remember, that's kind of my wheelhouse is research. So there's not going to be a word that comes out of my mouth that I don't have about 5 or 6 research papers behind it. So yeah, it's all heavily researched.
And I was just going to say, just moving on, if you actually put Halsteds Principles into ResearchGate, they are sort of all of the work that underpins in the human field, maximizing surgical recovery. So not only just looking at exercise, but nutritional principles, drug therapy, etc. I think it's HALSTED, Halsted's Principles. So it's quite well recognized in the field of human medicine.
And then Rach Grundy says this is so relevant to rehabilitation for IVDD cases as well. Lowri, I don't know if you want to expand on IVDD at all.
Yeah, I mean, sort of, I think, historically, perhaps we've been really scared of moving our sort of neurological cases. And I think, you do have to be very judicious in your approach to them, particularly if you are managing them conservatively. But certainly post-surgery, there is a plethora of documented evidence that shows, again, I'm sort of looking at sort of the brain and the neural journals, maybe not necessarily the more classic veterinary journals, but all of the work that underpins human spinal rehab is done on animals. So I think it is pretty relevant to us, shows that the earlier you start working on the plasticity of the neural system through sort of exercise, and this is sort of can be measured through looking at brain-derived neurotrophic factor profiles, which drives plasticity and movement in neural recovery, that early functional exercise is critical for these cases.
Thank you. And Michael seconds that suggestions for citations for non-rest would be great to show to veterinarians, with the current treatment being 6 weeks of crate rest for post-TPLO. We definitely need to change that. So thank you.
There's also work on mechanotransduction. I don't know actually if I'm going to get to it, but it's like one of my final slides that again looks at tissue adaptation to load. And if you put mechanotransduction into ResearchGate, you'll come up with a whole heap of papers as well.
Right. And very quick, we really do have to know how to look at research. I mean, I've sat there in a conference, in a educational conference, and saw someone do a whole segment on a sample size of 6 and another one on a sample size of 2. And I'm like, what? And it was a little bit, old school, and the thing with research is it's a starting point. And those of us who've, gone through a doctoral program, the reason that we go through this program is to be able to be researchers. So you learn that doing research is not just an add-on, but it's a skill in itself. And I think because we've had to work so hard to get that designation, that we think it's really important, but it is. And you have to take tons and tons and tons of statistics, because that's one way that you can evaluate research. But I still remember, after 4 years of going through statistics with the same professor, what he said to all of us as we left as pre-doctoral candidates. He said, the only thing I want to tell you now that we've just gone through all these statistics is that a gold standard statistical evaluation is probably not as good if the sample size is small or medium as a large scale anecdotal. He said, you have to trust your instincts. And with the way that research is out there, and it's not always refereed like you think it should be through some journals, there's journals everywhere, and people can say, I published research, but it's on some obscure journal. You can pretty much find research to say anything you want it to say. So you have got to, number one, be careful about where you find your research. And number two, you have to understand that when you have an anecdotal of 10,000 treatments and you are a good record keeper, that data is probably more valuable than a double blind of 32. So you, as practitioners, please never think that you are below in status or knowledge from someone who's a PhD researcher. I say the only thing that a PhD or a higher education does is teach you how much you still need to learn. You practitioners out there with 10,000 cases, you got to tell the researchers what you're finding, and you have to be confident in what you know, because you do know a lot more than many of the researchers out there.
I think that's particularly important in the veterinary field when it's actually quite a small pond, and the rehab field is even smaller. So there's a classic paper on the management of intervertebral disc disease, which sort of would not probably stand up to scrutiny in the proper world of science, and is often thrown to say, there's no benefit from doing early rehab with these dogs. But it's not a great paper, and there are no papers to counter it. Now, there are papers to counter it, as I said, in Brain and all the neurojournals. But I think you do have to be careful. If that's the paper that you were sort of basing your rehab practice on, you would actually probably be doing sort of good rehab than if you hadn't read the paper at all.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button so you get notified every time I load a new podcast. And please, if you get a moment, head over to Stitcher or iTunes and leave me a review. It's a really lonely job being a podcaster, and so the only time I get to hear from you or know that you're out there is when I get a review. And know that I read every single one of your reviews. So to those of you that have left reviews, I want to say a very big thank you. Every time we get a review, it really helps to get the Veterinary Rehabilitation podcast out there to all the vet rehabbers all over the world. Alright, vet rehabbers, so if you are looking for more continuing education in the field of veterinary rehabilitation, head over to onlinepethealth.com. Go be awesome, guys.